And it says connected now, and we're about to go live on YouTube, I think.
Okay. We're live on Facebook. So hi, everybody. This is Dan Libenson, and we are here again for an episode of the show that we call Stone News. I'm here with Yehonatan and Shadmi. Hey, how are you doing, Yehonatan?
Hey,
And
Dan, how are you?
I'm good. So I just want to let our folks know who are watching that we're experimenting with a new way of streaming just for this show today, because we are trying to get this show to appear both on the Jewish Live channels and also Yonatan's channel, which is called Fear of Isaac on YouTube. And so we apologize if there are any glitches. We thought it was a worthy experiment, and hopefully it's at least at least we know that it's going to the Jewish Live Facebook and to the Fear of Isaac YouTube channel right now. And if it's not live on the Jewish Live website at the moment, the archive will be there. So anyway, Yonatan, how are you? I guess you asked me last week. How was I? How are you?
Well, it was Independence Day yesterday in Israel, and we were talking about how Independence Day became kind of contentless, like not contentless, but just a party basically. So we met with some friends, were able to we had coronavirus quarantine, but under the rules, some neighbors could come to you. So we had them over, and we did some barbecue. I ate way too much. I'm sure that's of interest to everyone, but I ate way too much, and I'm kind of still in the post-holiday mode, I guess. How about you?
I am good. I'm just was posting our title on Facebook. I'm good. It's interesting. I'm trying to think, like, what's the next American holiday that's coming up? I guess it's Memorial Day, which is at the end of May.
Of familiar.
Which is similar to the Memorial Day in Israel, except that at least the Memorial Day in Israel right now is like a very raw day, at least publicly, whereas Memorial Day, it's so weird in America, like, to have a holiday called Memorial Day, and it actually is meant to be a memorial for I believe it's Memorial Day for the people who died in World War II, and Veterans Day is World War I. I'm not 100% sure, but it's kind of lost its memorialness, except for certain people who've really lost somebody in the military. So and it's mostly like sales and barbecues. I guess it won't be barbecues this year so much.
Yeah.
Anyway,
we're actually going to discuss
we're not there yet.
We're actually going to discuss. It was Memorial Day in Israel as well, and there's these interesting ceremonies around that. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. And we're going to talk today about, first of all, about the week's news, and that includes the UFOs in the Pentagon, and it includes a very unusual thing that happened in a video game called Fortnite. If you don't know it, and if you have kids, they know it for sure, or grandchildren. And we're also going to talk about what I think is probably Israel's most important contribution to the history of sort of Jewish sacred rituals, which is a Memorial Day siren, the Tzfirah. But I thought that first let's try to discuss why are we doing this? Like, why does the news, political news, like what used to be called the 6 o'clock news, why are they spiritually important? And I want to begin by suggesting that the world and the cosmos, or God, or the unconscious, or whatever term is the most sort of least frightening, they seem to continuously send us messages. The world is continuously sending us messages which are in fact not cryptic at all, but almost ridiculously and comically obvious, guiding us towards fulfilling our purpose here, as it was. And sort of the problem, the reasons that many of us, myself included, are not really fulfilling their purpose in the world, is that we don't want to hear it. It's not because it's not being broadcast. Speaking about streaming stuff, the stream is there, but you need to want to hear it, or at least to accept accept the messages. Now, I know this sounds crazy, right? Because mentally unstable people sometimes claim, for example, that the clouds have a personal message encoded just for them. There's actually a great story by Nabokov called Symbols and Signs about how that goes wrong, people who believe that the clouds are speaking with them. But to me, the problem with that scenario is not with believing that the clouds or the news communicate with you, but rather that they are telling you that you are the Messiah, or to, God forbid, hurt people, or stuff like that. When in fact, one of the ways to recognize that you really are in tune with the thing that we're talking about, with the world, is that the messages we receive from the cosmos are mundane and usually quite moderate and gradual. They may be harsh, they may be kind of tough, but they're gradual. We're not Moses, and we don't get to directly go to the burning bush, and that tells us to lead Israel out of Egypt. It's something else. So the news is like one way in which God or the subconscious or what have you is communicating with us and giving us personal messages. And if this still sounds crazy, I think it's worth to consider the very, very long history of this notion, of this sort of phenomenon. Like if we start just 200 years ago, you have Hasidic masters, and they were absolutely certain that the news of their days carries specific personal messages for them. They were obsessed with Napoleon, for example. And every latest political development in Russia and in Eastern Europe, they completely read it as if it was God speaking with them. And the thing is, this is not just for masters, this is for everyone. If you look at astrology in the Middle Ages, by the way, astrology is making a huge comeback with millennials and with Zoomers. I just saw some data on that. So astrology, in the Middle Ages, the assumption was, and that was very common, that the cosmos, not just the news, the cosmos, the stars, the planets, carry a specific personal message for you. The stars literally have a map with personal meaning for you. And perhaps most importantly and most interestingly, before that, in a time that I think was very important for Judaism and very important for the Western world, you had the Romans 2,000 years ago. And they, like the big thing about the Roman religion, it's not their gods. If you look at the Roman gods, they're kind of disappointing. They're really not as mythologically or psychologically developed as the Greek gods, for example. But what the Romans did was to put a huge spiritual emphasis on the concrete. It was really important to them, like whatever, like you leave your house and do you see a white dove or a brown dove? And did the dove make a right turn or a left turn? They put like a lot of weight on those kinds of things. Like concreteness is a way that the gods express themselves for the Romans. And the Romans, by the way, also believed in holy law. That's also a kind of concrete thing. And then what the sort of editors of the Mishnah and later the Talmud did is they created the Jewish holy law, another something that is very concrete, and afterwards halacha, which, as you know, is all about concreteness and all about what we're eating and have we been to the bathroom. And you can also claim that Jesus took concreteness to another direction, and for some interpretation of early Christians, concreteness meant an emphasis on how moral you are in the actual world, not in the rule book. So just the news is a concrete thing that carries personal and collective messages for Dan and for Yoni and for whoever is watching this. And like one last thing, I want to one other way to look at it is to use the term, there's a postmodern philosopher called Althusser, and I'm probably mispronouncing his name. And he was all about something that he called interpellation, which is the world calling upon you. And for him, that was like the basic experience of existing. The best example that, like for me, the best example that he gave that I liked, he said, let's say you're alone in your home and you're all over the place. You're thinking about work, you're tidying up the home, you're watching Netflix, you're kind of, these bits and pieces of you are out there. And then there's a knock on the door. And according to Althusser, the knock on the door is it's like what makes you whole. Now you have to be a person because there's another person there, no longer bits and pieces. So that's what we're going to talk about today and go into like specific concrete news examples.
Okay, yeah, I mean, like my question is kind of like would love to get a contemporary example just to get a sense of what you mean and how you mean in terms of the distinction between the news, let's say, mattering for us versus some kind of when you say a personal message, what do you mean by that?
Sure. Um, so the thing about the news, what's interesting about them, and like the most academic example of this is Anderson and his idea of imagine virtual communities, that the news are collective, right? It's something that happens to all of us. So we kind of spoke last week about rewilding. We talked about that there are news that monkeys in Bangkok sort of overtook urban spaces, and wild boars in Haifa overtook urban spaces because of the quarantine. And what that tells me is that the subconscious is making a push. And we're going to talk about that today when it comes to UFOs. There were big UFO news this week. It's like, again, in a way, it's like bad literature. It's such a concrete metaphor. It's too much. Like if we would have written a story and we would say, well, the hero needs to understand that he needs to, or she needs to reach deeper into her subconscious. And then we would say, she sees on the news that a boar overtook a shopping mall. That's too much, right? And this is something that has been repeated about the corona as well, that some authors, TV authors and novelists said that this is like too much. This is too, it's our loneliness and our isolation that are taking virus form. Like it doesn't work as a story because it's so clear. So this is kind of what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, tell me more. Like I'm trying to kind of get inside of what you're saying and kind of like I'm also curious, like historically, I was drawn in by what you said about the Hasidic masters being so interested in Napoleon. I didn't know about that. So what was that about?
So there was a lot of talk, is Napoleon like the Messiah because he's going to give the Jews rights and emancipation and all that? Is Napoleon like not the Jewish Messiah, but sort of the horse on which the donkey on which the Messiah is coming? And other people said that this is like kind of the Jewish version of the Antichrist. It's the other way around. He's going to destroy all the communities. And that was like one level of it. And then beneath it, they treated Napoleon, for example, as something that is like when he won a battle, for them, that meant that they need to do certain Kabbalistic rituals, for example, or that their Kabbalistic rituals worked. And it always coincided with their personal, like, okay, so they have like a few new students coming in, new Hasidic students, and Napoleon just lost a battle, so that means something. And again, it doesn't have to be the news. The news, I think it's a good thing for us modern people to use. For other people, it can be the clouds, that the clouds are telling you something. Look at the clouds. Yep.
No, it was interesting. Like, I think that as I'm hearing you, I'm thinking about like this question that I have. I forget if we maybe discussed this before in a certain way, but it's on my mind because one of our other shows that's on Jewish Live, the Idra Hour, had an interview with Rabbi Zach Kamenetz, who's one of these rabbis who participated in the psilocybin experiments at Johns Hopkins, where they gave the clergy psilocybins, i.e., magic mushrooms, and psychedelics, and kind of see what happens. And I'm always thinking about how my question for people who have this kind of experience when they take psychedelics and they feel close to God and everything, is like, but that it was just kind of doing something to your brain chemistry, and they say, yeah, of course I know that, like, I mean, I'm not stupid. I understand that it was just, but nevertheless, I feel that, what it did was it connected me to something that was really there, and that's where I'm trying to kind of, struggle with this question of like, on the one hand, we know that the news isn't really sending us personal messages, or the clouds aren't sort of really sending us personal messages. And at the same time, the fact that we experience it as though it were is actually something significant. Maybe it's like a dream, that actually a dream matters. Like a dream is really telling you something real,
Yep.
but it's not necessarily
Yep.
like God is telling you the real thing. It's that
So I
you
want to
yourself
go
are
out
telling.
there
You want
and
to go
sort
further?
of take the risk. Sorry. Go on, Dan.
No. I'm
I
asking.
just
So you want
agree.
to go further than that? Yeah.
Yeah, and just take the risk of losing sort of any future employment opportunities, and say that I do believe that the news are sending us messages. I do believe that the world is sending us messages. But and the interesting thing is what you just said, because there's another way to construct this. And for me, it's saying the same thing. It's saying, well, the mind has a tendency to find patterns in things where there are no patterns. So because of the way that we are constructed, the mind thinks that some coincidences are patterns, right? So you could also go and say, your love for your children, that's basically evolution, sort of pushing you to take care of your genes, to push your genes in other generations. And it's not that that's wrong, but it's very narrow, and it's not the truth, it's just a part of the truth. And one of the interesting things, I have like a quantum physicist that I kind of, he works in Paris in a very well-known laboratory. And one of the things that he always says that like a good scientist, they don't really know stuff. They're always like saying, when they want to say I'm sure of something, they're saying like, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, something like that. And you can see sometimes the interplay with the media, that you have a scientist that comes forward and says, well, we did some experiments and we got the X result. And then the media would make it into the X result is the truth. And they're always kind of ruining the news items. They're always kind of saying, well, we don't know that yet. So saying our minds has a tendency to find patterns, that's fine. And saying, I don't really love my kids, it's just an evolutionary instinct, that's also fine. And it's not like wrong, but it is wrong to think that's the whole truth. And the way to become a believer in this is just practically to try it again and again and again. And again, if it makes you feel comfortable, and this will unleash your mind's tendency to find patterns. They will come up. So I want to, let's try to just do something like that. Let's look like at the news that we want to talk about this week. So we can start with, we can start with Memorial Day. We can start with Memorial Day. So in Israel, it was this week, and the central ritual of the Israeli Memorial Day for fallen soldiers and also like terror victims is what's called the Tzfira, which is a siren. And I like to call it the Zionist Muazzin, kind of a translation of the Islamic call to prayer to Israeli Jewish terms. And just for anyone who doesn't know it, there are sirens literally in every Israeli street, which are also used for emergencies. But during the Memorial Day, for 1 minute, the sirens go on, and you hear kind of, and it's a minute long, and there's no other content around it. And what you're supposed to do, and what everyone still does, is they stop everything, including like driving on the highways, and they stand in silence. This is, again, if you would try to come up with an equivalent for like Israeli meditation or something like that, this would be too literal, right? It's like a national call for a meditation, like a national gong. And we're supposed to take this minute to think of the dead, in a way to make the dead living again, as it were, in our minds for a minute. And this is like a classic interpellation ritual, right? It's a ritual that you walk down the street minding your own business, and then suddenly a knock on the door. Suddenly a and it kind of forces you to join in, right? That's also very Israeli. It's really aggressive.
Right.
Like if you can't, usually for rituals, you can opt out. You can not come to the temple, for example. You can like don't go to synagogue if you don't want. But if you don't want to take a part in the tzfira, you have to literally shut your ears. So it kind of forces you into this contentless minute, just like a moment in time. And so it happened at 8 in the evening, and I was, as it happened, I was reading a bedtime story for my two girls. The oldest is 3, and the youngest will soon be 2. Like they're not really at the age where you kind of really communicate what that's about. I told them, well, look, a lot of people built this country and this is about them, something along those lines. I don't know what stays there. It's impossible to know. And I told them, like, obviously in advance. And and we were reading, we don't have to go into this, but we were reading a story, a bedtime story about a gorilla. It's called A Gorilla. It's a great bedtime story. And we were just at this moment, which they both really like. It's this really sad moment when the girl is parting from a gorilla, whatever, the whole story. And they're usually really active when they listen to bedtime stories. And the siren came in at the exact moment where they stop, where they never interact. They take a moment to sort of the sadness of the moment, they take it in. And then we all had to stand and sort of bask in the sadness. For them, the lost gorilla, for me, other stuff. And it's a coincidence, right? Mm-hmm. It's just a coincidence. Mm-hmm. But the thing is that once you turn your mind on to that stuff, like every given day, you get 20, 30, 40 of these. Mm-hmm. And with people who are what's called Balei Tshuva, how do you say, people who are becoming Orthodox, mm-hmm. like one of the stages of their process, which is known from other spiritual traditions as well, is having that thing turned on all the time. And mm-hmm. they always say, they believe that they're seeing the invisible like hand of God in almost any moment. And it's called the Orot period, the lights period. And it goes away, by the way. That's part of it. So it's just there, you know? It's there if you choose to see it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, like, you know, I think it's a little hard for me to, you know, wrap my mind around it because there's this strong part of me that says, well, I understand that that's not really happening. I guess I don't believe that that's really happening. You know, I mean, like, and yet I take it seriously nonetheless, because I think that what's really happening, I believe, is that your mind has somehow opened itself to something that your own mind is trying to get you to see or get you to do. And mm-hmm. and I suppose that in some ways, like I don't make light of the belief that it's actually coming from an external source, because I think that I'm also aware that in the world of, let's say, neuroscience, right, there is, you know, the strictest version of neuroscience, I think, would say there is no mind. You know, that the mind and the body are the same, you know, that there's no way to talk about your mind sending you a message. I mean, it's the same organism. And yes, I guess what I would say, and this kind of goes back to what we were talking about last week in terms of mythology and, you know, storytelling, that is ways that we have, you know, that I think of as the user interface for wisdom. And that, I understand, and I understand that my mind is not separate from me, and it's not that my mind is sending me a message or something like that, or my conscience, or whatever you want to call it. And yet that's a story that helps me make sense of what's happening. And so I'm okay with a story that's a little broader than that, right? And it says that God is trying to send a message, or the world is trying to send a message. And I guess I wonder, you know, this is where I always live with in the world of religion or mythology, is kind of like when we use these words, how whether the word is God or the word is the world is trying to tell us something or sending us a message, how literally do we mean that? And I live very comfortably in the world where we say we don't literally mean that. We don't necessarily not mean it. We don't know. And it's very, and I'm certainly, it's possible that it's literally happening, but it's also possible that it's not literally happening. And the question in my mind is, does it matter? Does it really matter which it is? And since I kind of believe that it doesn't really matter. Mm-hmm. And by the way, like, one of the reasons I believe it doesn't matter is connected to the other show that I do on Thursdays with B'nai Lappi, where we talk about the Talmud. And the episode that we talked about last week, or 2 weeks ago, I guess, was this famous story in the Talmud called the Oven of Achnai, and it's this story where the voice of God actually comes and tells the rabbis what the law ought to be, and they say, we don't listen to the voice of God anymore. God, you had your chance to talk at Mount Sinai, and we don't have to listen to you anymore. And so even if it is the voice of God, that doesn't mean that we have to do or the voice of the universe, right?
Okay. So that's a great example, I think. That's a great example. So I have two questions for you. The first, if all of this is a game, the games that, the Romans played, they played in the Middle Ages, the Hasidic masters played, I think it's well worth to ask, can I personally, and maybe anyone who's watching, can I play that game?
Yes.
Can I, after watching what we're doing now, can I look at the world and say, well, the world is, I'm looking at the wall over here, is constantly sending me messages. Am I secure enough to play this game, and not thinking I'm going to go crazy?
Right.
Because again, biologically, it's going to happen. You're going to find the patterns. And the Tanur Shel Achnai, the Oven of Achnai, and I love the show that you do with B'nai. It's amazing. And I think like where I usually find myself nodding along, and the parts where I say no, like I usually hear it anyway, Friday afternoon. The parts where I say no are like last time where you thought that's sort of where you describe the Torah quotes in the Bible as a marketing technique, which I think it is a marketing technique, but there's also something much deeper there. And the sort of what I take from the Oven of Achnai, where they say, okay, so the voice of God, that's not the voice of God. That's what we said. Those are the sort of clouds telling you are a Messiah. That's not the voice of God. The voice of God is that person that was sitting near the table where they were talking or at the table, and then he suddenly quoted something from the Torah, which was completely unrelated. Because he was free, because he let his mind wander towards patterns, he said, well, this is just like that Bible quote. I don't remember the quote, but that's the voice of God. And this is the beautiful part. He didn't have to sort of logically draw the line and say, well, this quote is relevant because of this. But rather, this is how God expresses itself through these mundane things. It's not through this great voice.
Well, in fact, right, that's a fascinating read because what the quote, there are two quotes. One that we didn't explore that much, which is that the rabbi Joshua, who says we don't have to listen to the voice of God, says it's not in heaven. He quotes the Torah, it's not in heaven, but he sort of is, that's not a misquotation, but it's a little bit out of context, or I would say a lot out of context. There's another quote which says, what somebody else is explaining what Rabbi Joshua meant, and he says that the Torah says you should follow the majority. And when you look it up, it actually says you should not follow the majority. And what I think is interesting, what I think is interesting in the way that you're describing it, if I understand, is that, like, yes, the text actually says you should not follow the majority, but in some way, this person was sincerely hearing a voice from the text that said you should follow the majority, and that was actually legitimately, a voice of God.
The news says that Trump said to drink bleach, God forbid, or I don't know how he said it. What he really says is he's saying free your mind, free your mind. Trump is a very radical example of a person who really freed his mind in a bad way, in the Messiah way. But what it says, if the president of the United States can stand up on stage and go, well, just instinctively, well, maybe bleach will, then we can take, for example, the words of the Torah and play around with them. And we don't have, and it's okay to misquote. It's okay to lie. It's okay to get away from the truth. We spoke about it last time. Our grasp on the truth is so fickle. Our bodies are so, it's just flesh, we're monkeys. A gorilla comes to you and tells you, well, I know the truth. You know some part of the truth, gorilla, okay.
Right.
Okay, so we can move on to sort of the next related story that happened, which is astronomical. Astronomical, it's the name of a song by a guy called Travis Scott. He's like a fairly successful singer. And you had 12.3 million people this week logging on into Fortnite, which is a multiplayer video game. And to what was basically, I think, pretty much sort of influenced by the ritual at Sinai and by Hollywood special effects. And you had like a 12 minutes experience You can look it up online. You can write astronomical and fortnight. And everyone who was there, it started with kind of this mystic ball of light that exploded into Travis Scott. And then Travis Scott very, very obviously took the look of a god, of sort of a pagan god. And it was like a textbook. They went through the shamanic journey. 12 minutes of the shamanic journey where you go to heavens and you have the sort of challenging dark parts, and they went under the sea, and there was the animals, and there was, it was like a classic religious ritual. And this is another thing, like the UFOs we're going to talk about, and the animals that we spoke about, and even Trump to an extent, of these forces really like knocking on our rational mind and asking us not to give up on our rational mind, but to allow for that other thing as well, to start playing around with life in a way that in our specific day and time is needed. And the people who can do it, a lot of times it's the bad guys. It's like they're these wizards. They're playing around with reality in a way, and we keep looking at it, at the politics. This happens in Israel as well with the right wing, and you're saying, look, but this is wrong, this is false, because we're not able to play, because we're not able to do this thing. So they're going to keep beating us until we'll be able to get those kind of capabilities, magic capabilities.
And
yeah, sorry.
No, it had, and like, so how did this go over? Like, what are people saying about it?
So, like my favorite sort of commentary on it is like I have like a friend of my cousins, and he said, and both of their parents are, his parents are musicians, and he said, well, this was my first rock concert. Like when my parents spoke about rock concerts, this is how I interpret this. And in Jewish life, you constantly talk about digital experiences as sort of a possible gateway towards, I guess, religion. And like for them, it's not even a question. Like, of course, it's not only it's as meaningful as the real world, it's probably more meaningful. The real world is kind of a letdown after something like that. And I think it's interesting to kind of, how do you say juxtaposition? How do you put when you take
juxtapose or juxtaposition?
Juxtapose. That's such a fun word, juxtapose. So
they talk about like there's some words in English that sound like Yiddish, like far-fetched. That sounds kind of far-fetched. But juxtapose is just a cool one.
Yeah, it's fun. It makes you juxtapose. It's really musical, yeah, like Yiddish. So let's juxtapose astronomical with the Torah. We talked about it last time. Like astronomical was, again, like the ultimate shamanic ritual as performed by special effects. And I think there's a generational gap here because I didn't experience it as anything religious. I wasn't able to. I was kind of there, and I thought it was cool. I thought it was like kind of a movie. And we talked about how the Torah doesn't have any special effects. How the Torah as a mythology is pretty boring. It's pretty shallow. And there's this article by Yehoshua Leibovich, the late philosopher.
Yeshayahu
Leibovich, sorry, why did I say Yeshua? Yeshayahu Leibovich, where he kind of disses the Torah, and he goes on like, as poetry, it's not as good as Shakespeare. As mythology, it's not as good as other mythologies. And I think that's kind of true. And the kind of mythologies that I connect to personally, it's much more mundane. It's much more like the Torah. It's much more just kind of two people talking, and then you have this character that is God, which is very obviously a character and very obviously like a Canaanite specific chieftain God. And that doesn't seem to bother anyone to the extent that Abraham speaks with a God called El, which is a specific Canaanite God.
Right.
And to me, like to connect to what we talked about, God will take the form of whatever, of a pigeon. That's fine if a pigeon works for you. And of a Canaanite chieftain, if that's what works for you, Abraham. It's all about allowing it. And also of not the person, Travis Scott, but the sort of Travis Scott of the mind, if you will. And it's good to sort of at least for me, where we are, we need to allow God in whatever way that we can.
Mm. It's interesting. Like I was thinking a little bit about how when we had a conversation with an Israeli novelist named Ruby Namdar, who wrote a book kind of, it's called The Ruined House. It's about somebody having visions of the temple in Jerusalem and also going through his life as a kind of professor in New York and just kind of as sort of mundane life. But what in our conversation with Ruby on the Judaism Unbound podcast, he said something really interesting, which was that when the temple was destroyed, like a lot of us say, yeah, it was sad when the temple was destroyed, but I mean, thank God, because who would want to be making sacrifices today? It's disgusting and terrible animal abuse and all kinds of things. And he said, well, of course that's true, and yet that there was something much more powerful about a Judaism that had, it was visceral. There was blood. There was something was happening. And now and then and he says and then rabbinic Judaism is, as others have said, words, right? And that there's an attempt, and the rabbis are very clear about this, to try to kind of mirror the sacrificial service. So there was an evening service and a morning service and a midday service, and so we do that now with prayers instead of sacrifices. But Ruby was talking about what a loss there is, because you go from something visceral and powerful to something, kind of boring. And and then, and the question is that kind of an inevitable direction in which society goes? But then it feels like what you're describing with Astronomical and Fortnite. I was thinking two things. I mean, I'm thinking like one thing, that technology potentially is moving in a direction, and we see it in movies like The Matrix and Ready Player One, where when the technology gets to a certain point where we can have this kind of immersive 3D technology and it's all worked out, a little better, you might be able to go back to, and one of our first episodes of Judaism Unbound with Paul Golan, we talked about this, like you might actually be able to feel like you're at Sinai, in many ways. And so in some way, this is like the first time in 3,000 years or maybe more where, because maybe it never happened and it was only a myth, but now we can actually experience it in a real way. And then I was also thinking about, again, these conversations about psychedelics, which really, came into the popular culture a few years ago. Michael Pollan wrote a book, and there's all kinds of, it's like in the air. And it kind of feels almost like the combination of highly developed immersive technology and psychedelics. Like you can imagine, I mean, it could be extremely dangerous, but you can also imagine that somebody having this incredible experience that people have pretty much not had in modern times, or very, very few have had that, and they could be sort of democratized. I guess the question is like, is that good? I mean, like, would that be good? And there are people who, I think about people who follow the Grateful Dead or Fish or whatever, Burning Man. There are people that are out there having these experiences, but they're these incredibly intense experiences, right? But they tend to be relatively only every once in a while, every year, every few months. Even people that take psychedelics, I think that most people aren't doing it every day. It's just every once in a while. And I don't know, it's just like there's a line in the Torah where these people come to complain to Moses that there are a few people in the camp that are prophesying. That the story is a little more complex. Moses had made a big party, and there was like the spirit of prophecy came over all the people at the party. But then when it was over, these two people, I think, were still prophesying, and the people, his assistants, come and they complain to him about it. And Moses' response is like, basically, I wish everybody was a prophet, basically, because I'm so exhausted, right? But it's what if everybody was a prophet? What is that? What kind of a world would that be?
I think for us to, I don't know if reach that specific world, but sort of reach the kind of world that I think that you are describing, we want two things to happen. One, which is actually the easier part, get much more serious about the Torah and about the Talmud, and also other texts, but these specifically because they survive, because they're mainstream, because and look at them. What I suggest is looking at them as a series of stories of people who heard God. They heard God. Again, subjectively, and you can see it's actually easier to see in the Talmud, which is kind of more rational and closer to us. And just assume that they heard God, and you want to kind of learn from them. Not do as they did, but kind of go with them. So we want to get much more serious about those texts. And so that's the first part. But the second part is, as we read them or as we interact with them, can we allow our mind, I'm going to use like a bad example, but can we allow one, like the guy in the Oven of Achnai, who just stood up and, again, in a dreamlike logic, said the specific passage, the specific paragraph from the Torah. Those two things, get the tradition and free your mind, those two things together, it seems to me like a pretty clear recipe for the next stage of Judaism, and which is pretty much needed. And that kind of takes me to the last news item that we want to talk about, which is, to me, very relevant, which is UFOs.
Yeah, I'm excited about this one.
So
I'm excited about this stuff.
You're excited? Why are you excited about this one?
Well, for two reasons. One, I mean, I've just always been a sci-fi person, but the other is that I forget if we talked about this. I actually feel I've been having this feeling about UFOs, like I've been feeling about the pandemic, which is that it's something that like the government has known about for a long time, but didn't really tell us. And in the same way that we are shocked by the pandemic and the social distancing, but the government is not necessarily shocked by it because it was one of the plans that they all had in mind and knew about. That maybe that's also true of UFOs and extraterrestrials.
Yeah, I think those things are connected, and those things are also, dare I say, they connected to the Torah, they're connected to the Talmud, they're connected to the sort of mode of being that is needed from us. So just, if you haven't seen this, the Pentagon officially released this week detailed videos of 3 UFOs. They like to call them UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomenons. And if you look at both the films and the sort of data that they released, these are very obviously artificial, like they're made by something. They're not natural, and they're obviously very, very advanced. They're flying in unbelievable speed and doing unbelievable maneuvers. And this is part of something that has been going on in the recent years, going back to John Podesta, which was Clinton's chief of staff, of very slowly releasing information about UFOs by the government, by the military, by high-ranking retired officials. There's Senator Reid that said that these new videos are just the tip of the iceberg. In other words, it seems that UFOs are going to feature more prominently in human culture in the coming years, possibly even this election cycle. And to me, this is, again, the cosmos or God or what have you being very vulgar and very obvious about sort of our need to expand our mind. And just sort of seriously thinking about UFOs, it's the sort of things that sort of kind of releases us from the internal cage of our daily anxieties. And this kind of release, I think it can be very valuable, because then you go back to your cage, you go back to your daily life, and you can start moving around in them. And I think that's one of the reasons why it was repressed for so long, because it's a dangerous thing. It's a danger. Any political change that starts in your personal life is the most dangerous or is the most effective political change.
So how does a UFO, how is that an example of one that starts in your personal life?
Because if you start to seriously consider because we all have a worldview, right? We have a worldview, which for anyone who's watching this show, well, maybe not anyone, but many people who watch this show, is probably fairly rational. And we think we know. We think we understand the universe. And if tomorrow there's like a very clear evidence of, say, alien communication, that would, maybe not immediately, but it would shake us to our core. It would be, some people say, like the most important event in human history. I don't know about that, but what that does is it's sort of, it reminds you of how limited not just wrong, but limited our notions of reality are.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've been sitting here trying to persuade you that the clouds are speaking with you.
Right.
And you can say, well, that's obviously not true. We know that's not true, but we know so little.
Right.
And like you said, the little that we know is not evenly distributed. Some people knew about those UFOs for years and years, probably.
Right. Have you read there's a novel, I certainly can't pronounce the author's name, and I can't remember the title of the novel, but it's by Cixin Liu, I think, or it's a Chinese author and it was very popular a few years ago. What?
The Three-Body Problem.
The Three-Body Problem. Yeah. Have you read that?
No, I have not.
I read it.
Okay.
And like fundamentally, it's actually similar to this conversation in the sense that it kind of has to do with aliens talking to us through, and they're talking to us through kind of quantum, they're able to code messages and sort of I don't remember exactly, but in kind of atoms, and if you kind of lay out the atom, you can kind of get the message, something like that. It's a lot better written than I've just described it, but it actually brings together the two topics that you've been talking about, because in a sense, what it's saying is that yes, the universe is talking to us, and the reason why it's talking to us is because there's some alien life that's talking to us through the universe, which would be very interesting, right? And by the way, like that's an example, right? I mean, I know that you're saying something much more profound, but that would be an example where I might be saying, well, rationally, the clouds are not talking to us. And it turns out the clouds are talking to us, but it's because aliens are manipulating the clouds, right? Something.
Yeah, that's the Ezekiel theory, that Ezekiel saw a UFO.
Uh-huh.
UFO
well, I think that looking at the Hebrew prophets and all prophets is a fascinating exercise, especially for those of us who might be inclined to a more rational worldview, because the possibilities are they were crazy, they were on some kind of drugs, they were masters of some kind of shamanic abilities and rituals, and they had these visions just like shamans do, and it was because they altered their minds, maybe not through a drug but through a meditation or something like that, or God is actually talking to them, or they had some encounter with aliens, right? I mean, there's all kinds of possibilities, but and I think we could ask that not only about the Hebrew prophets, but actually I was a little bit inquiring into this very briefly the other day with Joy Layden, who was reading her poetry about the Shekhinah, the female divine manifestation, feminine divine manifestation. And, I was saying, like, as a poet, can you kind of bring us a little bit into the mindset of a prophet, in the sense that, something is kind of coming over you and you feel like you're channeling a voice that is not quite yours, and we had a little bit she had a little response there, but it was a very short exchange. But it makes you wonder, and Ezekiel in particular, right? I think he writes about, is it Ezekiel who writes about the fiery chariot and or the wheel that keeps on turning? Right, isn't there? There's a great. It's a REO Speedwagon song, I think. Right, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a very physical description. It sounds like.
Yeah. Right. So it yes, and so, by the way, and as a rational, from a rational point of view, there's zero reason to dismiss the likelihood of extraterrestrials and UFOs. In fact, it seems more likely that from a rational, it's actually more the strong desire for that not to be true, by people who are looking at it less rationally, that that are against it. So it's weird. The UFOs are a weird case, because on the one hand, because the UFOs kind of live in some weird place between the hyper rational and the hyper irrational, because I think probably both agree very strongly that there are extraterrestrials and that there probably are UFOs, and it's really like the people in the middle of the bell curve that don't agree.
It's a great way to put it, and that's how Jung put it as well. For him, that was like the ultimate modern myth, and myths were real for him. I think, like, whether we'll know about UFOs or not, the attempt to hear their or God's voice, that's like the important thing. And this is how I understand Leshma. Like, how do you translate Leshma?
for its own sake, like when you say we're studying Torah, not for a reason, but just for the sake of study, because it's an inherent good.
Yeah, and if we could do this switch, and we could say, well, we're studying now for the sake of sort of following the word of God. And the way that I put it now, you're going to think of like right-wing Christian preacher. But let's divorce it from that and say, yeah, we're doing it. We're doing it because we want to hear the voice of God. That's the Shema. We're not looking for neat ideas. We're not looking to renew Judaism. We want to hear God. I think that's a very creative mode, and whether that comes to us neurologically through some trick or from somewhere else, or maybe both of those things are true, that's not as important as actually trying it, I believe.
So on the subject of UFOs and the news relating to UFO, first of all, I guess it brings us full circle, because not only are there, is there evidence for the rational among us that there are UFOs, but it could also be an example of the news trying to speak to us personally. So I guess I would ask towards the end of our show, like, well, what might it be saying, or how are you experiencing that particular piece of news?
It's saying, to me, it's saying very clearly, well, Yoni, you don't know everything, and do the look at the world and let the world talk to you. Let the world seep into you. And if you hear a tree talking, don't dismiss it. Let the tree talk. Maybe it's God in the form of a tree. Let it talk. That's what I'm hearing.
Uh-huh. Great. I mean, and I could buy that. I can buy that.
Okay. Where does it take you?
I think I experience it with profound curiosity. I want to know more. I just want to know, where is this information? Like, I just want to know everything that anybody knows. And I think that the piece that, I don't know if this is connected to what you're talking about, but I think that what I experience with a piece of news like that is almost the opposite of the news talking to me, in the sense that I feel like there's more news that I've not heard, and that if I could hear all the news, then maybe I could make sense of it, and I could hear its voice more completely. And instead, I feel like I'm only being spoon-fed partial news, and then I kind of don't trust the news, and I don't trust my interpretation of it, and but I want to know more.
Well, wait with the second part. The first part, saying, well, this is what you're ready for. This is what you're not ready for the other parts. You, us, we. This is small steps, gradual steps. Remember, hey, we have a coincidence here. It's proved everything. We started by saying that it has to be gradual. Used for God, from God, always gradual. So this is what we're ready for. We're ready for the Pentagon re-releasing these videos, who are already on YouTube. By the way, that's a photo of a UFO.
Oh, nice.
And right there on the wall. And I suggest we end with this.
All right.
Great. Thank you, Dan.
Great. Good to see you again, and we'll see you again next week.
Yeah, same time.
All right. Bye-bye.